This is Signal, also known as Beep-Boop ASMR. The following work of weird fiction was written solely by me, and all ideas within are my own. There was no AI input. Episodes 61 Intermission to Episode 70 Intermission on Beep-Boop ASMR document my unintentional editing process for this story. If you are interested in hearing more of my narration or unintentional ASMR, links are listed below. And now, I hope you will enjoy my reading of Observer. "It's going to rain," said the old woman from behind Daisy. Daisy had been lost for a moment, looking out the diner's old rusty screen door. Outside, Main Street's dull concrete shimmered with waves of heat rolling off of it. Daisy patted her face and then her neck dry with a paper napkin. Her arm dropped to her side. "Can't see it myself, but I hope you're right. More coffee?" She turned away from the morning glare. The buttery yellow walls of the diner were bright from the morning sunlight shining through the windows. The chrome oscillating fan slowly pushed and pulled the already warm air left and right and left. Above, molted amber fly ribbons waggled and drooped in time. "It's going to rain, Daisy. I can feel it in my right knee. Even hard to walk today." The old woman sat at the counter, perched like a little gray bird at the edge of her stool, her poached egg and toast barely touched, her coffee long overdue for a top-off. "Well, I'm very sorry to hear your knee is acting up, but it does give me some hope for a change in this weather," Daisy said over her shoulder as she went to put on a fresh pot. The rest of Daisy's morning was filled with busy work, topping off shakers, organizing behind the service counter, wiping down stools and booths. Through the serving window, the fry cook expressed his misery throughout the day with clattering metal and coarse, one-sided arguments. The afternoon brought the old men, who met up to chew over politics, prices, and the past. They had known her father and brothers before the war when they were all alive. One would always ask how she was managing after her mother's recent passing. She had cared for her for years in the two-story home that had once been her mother's, her great-grandmother's, great-great-grandmother's, generations of widows. She brought the old men their usual coffees, pies, fried bologna sandwich, and pickled beet potato salad. She listened absently to the hum of their conversation as she distracted herself from the slow hours of heat. It was late afternoon when Daisy felt a cool breeze that kissed the sweat across the back of her neck. She had been looking out the large front plate-glass window, watching an old sun-bleached shred of paper taped to the glass softly flutter in the wind like a long-dead butterfly, forever caught and long ignored. She walked to the screen door, opened it, and looked far down Main Street, past the town, to where the bright golden fields met the thin strip of black that lay dangerously across the horizon. And then a movement caught her eye. At the end of the block, heading her way, was a man in a dark blue suit with an odd, narrow-rimmed dark fedora. She leaned on the doorframe, crossed her arms, and enjoyed the moment of rest in the soft, cooling wind. She dreamily watched the man as he moved closer in an easy, unhurried stroll. He stopped occasionally, looking in a window or doorway along the mercantile. She had never seen him before, and she could not see a car, so she decided he must be from out of town. Visiting someone, then, she thought. Then, to her sudden surprise, he now stood across the street from her, his face in shadow, tilted upwards to the sky with such focus that she also looked up in the same direction. Nothing there, she thought with a slight shake of her head, and then with some humor she whispered, "How odd." When she turned her gaze to the man, he was staring directly at her. This gave Daisy a mild start, and an old voice in Daisy's head, her good sense voice, said, "If you have any good sense left in your brain, woman, you will tell him you are closing shop, lock up, and don't look back." Or what? Daisy scornfully thought. I'll turn into a pillar of salt. Her good sense voice always sounded like a long, dead, and detested, haughty grand-aunt who hit children over the head with her big black family Bible for sport. "You closing?" called the man from across the street. "Soon will be," she cheerfully replied. Smiling, she waved him over and then headed back to the counter to check on her coffee pot. It had soured, and making a new pot was just a waste. From behind her, she heard the screen door clatter against the frame and called back to the man. "Sorry, coffee's finished, but I can get you anything else." Behind her, she heard him settle into a stool at the counter. She cleaned and then rinsed the coffee pot, leaving it to dry upside down over a tea towel on the counter. The fry cook had long stopped making noise, and she suspected he was probably out back in the shade in his grubby whites, reading Louis L'Amour and chain-smoking his tailor-mades. She turned her attention to the stranger and saw he was reading the menu board that hung high on the wall behind her. She saw his eyes were a shade of brown so dark it seemed as though he had no pupil, or maybe no iris. Had he not had the darkly tanned smile lines to soften his eyes and face, Daisy thought his stare would have been quite eerie. Then he looked directly at her and smiled a slow, white grin, almost perfect, but for the gap between his two front teeth. It was disarming, endearing, and it made her almost forget her name. Now he said something, and she realized for a painful, cheek-reddening moment that she had been staring. She apologized and asked him if he could repeat himself. "Milk, deviled egg sandwich on white, hold the mustard." "Would you like that toasted?" Daisy, still muddled, remembered to ask. "No, ma'am. Also a side of plain potato salad, if you have it." They did, of course, and relieved, Daisy went back into the kitchen to fix his food. His smile had given her an ache in her chest, a pain she had not felt in some time. It was the weight of her spinsterhood, her age, her loneliness. It always sat there. But right now, seeing someone new, someone young and handsome, someone who, well, that pain sat real hard on her heart now, and not now, she whispered hard to herself through gritted teeth. Focus on this order, then lock up, go home, put your feet up and have a Coke. Cry poor me if you want to then, but not now. When she put his plate and glass of milk in front of him, he began to carefully cut the crusts off his sandwich. "Oh, I could have done that for you," said Daisy, watching. And then, her puzzlement overcoming her manners, she asked, "Have you got a bad tooth?" "No, no. Some colors are just challenging for my digestion. It's easiest to stick to white foods," he explained, as if that was perfectly rational. Daisy leaned against the back counter and looked at him, genuinely mystified. Then she gave him a sidelong, squinty look and said, "You're teasing me." "No, not at all," he said with absolute earnestness. "In fact, it's a bit of a secret." He casually looked down at his plate, focusing on his potato salad, leaving her curiosity hanging in the moment. Then, after a bite, he looked up at her with a playful smile and said, "I would like to tell you the secret." "All right," she said, smiling back, his playful congeniality becoming infectious. "When I was very, very young," he began, "I lived in the desert. Days were long and hot. Nights were just as long and very cold. The sun was so big and suffocating in the day that we had to hide. Freedom came at night under the glimmering void. My mate, who was very strong, always flew above me." At this, Daisy's head cocked slightly and she thought, "Wait, what did he just say?" But he continued, not noticing or maybe not caring that she was looking incredulously at him now. "I asked my mate many times, 'Take me up with you. Please take me up with you.' But I was ignored, always. Then on an especially hot afternoon, I was walking down a long, old path. The late afternoon was still too hot as Daisy walked down the sidewalk to her home. Ahead, the voices of children carried to her as they ran into the road to play after finishing their suppers. She looked to the end of the block, where she could just start to make out the corner of her old weathered picket fence. And then Daisy stopped so suddenly she nearly pitched forward. She looked down at herself. She was still wearing the diner uniform, the robin egg blue, slightly stained and in dire need of a wash. Her work shoes, no longer black, were gray with dust and held her tightly in their familiar ache. She touched her hair. It was loose around her shoulders and not tied back like it had been a moment ago. A moment ago. A moment ago. She looked at her wristwatch. Now, she was on time, long past when she would have said goodbye to the fry cook as he locked up the diner behind her. She was now just minutes away from home, just like she was every weekday at this time. Daisy touched the side of her face and tried to remember the last thing she had been doing. At first her mind was a blank, and then she remembered the face of the handsome man. He had been ordering food, and there had been a pattern to the food he ordered, something it all had in common. What had it been? Was this the first sign of a stroke? At this thought, the slack face of her mother snapped into her mind, her small gray head against the white hospital sheet. No, she ordered her brain to stop that thread of memory. This time it had worked. Daisy's brain had a very bad habit of reminding her as often as it could of old pain and old shame. Other than the memory lapse, she felt no pain or numbness. She wasn't dizzy. She could clearly see the old gray picket fence from where she was standing, just a few houses away. So, not a stroke. Daisy usually had pretty good instincts, and she could not explain it, but if asked, she knew the stranger at the diner had something to do with her memory loss. She felt this to be the truth to the very marrow of her bone. Yet she did not feel upset by this. In fact, when she tried to name what she was feeling in that moment, she realized with a strange absence of feeling, like her memory, her emotions were also blank. And then Daisy could hear her good sense voice at the back of her mind, tisk-tisking with I told you so's. "Oh, shut up, you old busybody," said Daisy tiredly to the voice of the long-dead great-aunt who paid no rent to live in her head. And at that moment she realized this was the second time she had spoken aloud to herself while standing in the road looking blankly into space. She wondered if anybody from the nearby houses on the block were watching her right now. Probably. And someday the old town mothers would use her as a cautionary tale to teach their daughters the perils of not finding a husband before the madness set in. This thought made Daisy feel a sudden cheerfulness, and she began walking again. In her yard, the lawn had long turned brown and dusty from the drought. When the rain barrel went dry, so did her flowers. It would have been a very sad sight if the property had not had a few beautiful old trees. Her favorite was the weeping willow that some ancestor had planted too close to the house, and she would someday, probably, have to take it down before a terrible storm did the job for her. The willow hung heavily over her home's veranda, and it was this very veranda she had planned to sit on in her rocking chair, with her naked feet propped up on the railing, so she could twinkle her toes in the evening breeze while sipping on a bottle of Coca-Cola. She loved this plan. It was a glorious plan. The only little problem with her otherwise perfect plan was the man with the stunning smile and strange eyes, now sitting in her rocking chair. She stood at the first of 6 steps up to her veranda, sagged a little, and let out a long, tired sigh. Then she looked up at him and saw that he had the nerve to be quietly laughing at her. She felt a flush of anger at him, as somewhere in the back of her mind her old, faithful, good-sense voice was telling her to call the sheriff. She did not. Instead, she pointed her finger directly at the laughing face, saying in a low and dark voice, "You put a whammy on me." That stopped him short, his face now serious. "You invited me," he said quietly. Had she? She tried to think, to remember the conversation at the diner. It was still a foggy place resting in her mind. But Daisy knew herself. She knew exactly what kind of woman she was, and there was no way in hell she would invite a complete stranger into her house, no matter how much of a mind trick this man had played on her. "No," she said firmly, "I did not." He sat quietly now, his elbow resting on the arm of the rocker, as he held his face and tapped his index finger thoughtfully at his cheek. Then he said, "You know, most people would agree with me to save themselves or me the embarrassment of this unusual situation." Daisy put a finger also to her cheek and looked up, pretending to be thoughtful. "Well, that's strange, because I think most people in this situation will call the sheriff, actually." "Is that what you're going to do?" he asked her, still serious and quiet. Daisy let her hand drop and began to climb her front steps. No, I am not. She imagined her good sense voice booing at her now, the old shrew thwarted again. No, I have no interest in drama. I have plans. She was pleased to see he moved over and let her have her old rocking chair. He was smiling at her again and said, Yes, you told me. Soda and the veranda, which is why I'm here. Which is why you invited yourself, Daisy replied, correcting him as she settled with a long, pleased sigh into the old, familiar chair that had been living in this spot long before she had been born. Then, bending over, she began to untie her shoes. After a moment of silence, he relented, and then nodded as he said, Yes, you are right. I invited myself. All right, she said. You can stay on my porch and have a soda with me on 3 conditions. And lifting her hand, she ticked off the conditions. 1, you never put a whammy on me again. What if it's accidental? He interrupted, to which she gave him an I wasn't born yesterday glare. Okay, he said. I will not put a whammy on you any time during our wonderful visit this evening. And this was good enough for Daisy, as she expected to never see him again after tonight. 2, she continued. I would like to know your name. Jacob Hatt, with 2 T's, he replied to her without hesitation. And 3, you will tell me the story again you were telling me in the diner, because I have questions. But now he was shaking his head no, and she waited for him to explain. Trouble is, Daisy, I can't fulfill the 3rd condition without breaking the 1st. Daisy was mildly exasperated. Are you telling me you have to put a whammy on me if I hear the story? No, he said with a slight shake of his head. I'm saying. And then he stopped and thought for a moment to consider his words. I'm saying, if I tell people some things, the universe or natural laws of the universe, I guess, well, that's what gives the automatic whammies. Like gravity. Like gravity, she repeated his words, looking at him dumbfounded. Her good sense voice came roaring back, yelling, Quick, run next door. Call the sheriff. He's a crackpot, a nut. Instead, Daisy asked, Do you want a Coca-Cola? And she saw Jacob relax into his seat and give her a grateful smile. I brought 7-Up. Would you like one of mine? Jacob started reaching down to the side of his chair where he had stashed 6 sweating green bottles. 7-Up because it has no color, right? Daisy said. And Jacob looked up at her, genuine surprise showing on his face. Daisy was very pleased that she'd been able to surprise him now. She smiled, saying, I only just remembered that little bit. Maybe more will come. That, Daisy, would be very interesting. I do hope you remember more. I really do. Then, using the veranda's banister, they popped the caps off their bottles and sat back companionably in the shade of the old willow. They watched as storm clouds creep to them in the early evening sky. She told him about the town, its long history, and now equally long death. She told him about her house and its nickname, the Old Widow House, which, given the history of her family, was accurate, but still felt a little unkind coming from the mouths of her neighbors. And Jacob told her about how he wandered, had always wandered, and always a few days ahead of the storm that would soon be there. He told her about the people and the animals he had met, He told her about being in a giant city beside the ocean with giant monuments and people pulling carts of hot food up and down long corridors filled with a multitude of people whose living and working spaces were stacked in tall boxes so high that it left the streets below almost in shadow. To him, it was surprising and exotic when he told her about his first time visiting a metropolis, and it suddenly seemed that way to her too. She wondered what he must think of her and her little town, where nothing moved but flies and horses' tails. He liked making her laugh, and she liked the sound of his, as it carried in the still of the growing dark before the storm. Then for a time they sat in happy and easy silence. Sometimes distant lightning would flash across the black sky, followed some seconds later by the boom and roll of thunder across the gleaming wheat fields. Each time Daisy counted, measuring the storm's steady approach. "I think it's going to be a very big storm," she said with a touch of anxiety. But what she was thinking was, he can't go out into that storm, but he can't stay with me. He must have somewhere to stay. And as she was trying to work out how to ask him, he said, "Daisy, I will have to leave soon, but I would like to know if it's okay if I come back and visit you again when I pass through." And Daisy felt a great gladness in her chest that she had made his friendship, and now did not want their time together to come to an end. Maybe she should let him stay on her Chesterfield for the night. Never mind how it would get the town in a white-hot round of gossiping for the next year. "I would like that, Jacob," Daisy said, just as a great downpour began to hammer the roof of her veranda, making her jump at the sudden violence of the storm. "I waited too long, Daisy. I can't leave by the road," he yelled at her over the hard rain. It was too dark to make out his face, and yet there seemed to be a trick of the light that made Jacob's eyes have a faint blue glow. Then, as though in slow motion, he turned his head to look into the yard, his eyes leaving faint blue smoky tracers behind. He said, "I'm sorry about your tree, Daisy." The glowing blue eyes slowly looked back at her as the long, smoky blue tracers followed. The glow seemed to be growing, and it made the hairs on her arms stand up. For just a moment, she had thought that those were not completely Jacob's eyes, and the light that shone from them was the glow of people or something trapped inside him, looking out of his eyes at her. He touched her shoulder. "It's okay, Daisy. I like you." His white teeth glowed against the impossible dark of his face, and it seemed to Daisy as if he was talking in slow motion, the breath from his words leaving his mouth in soft, lazy puffs of smoke that floated up to the roof of her veranda and pooled there. "Okay, Daisy, I'm going to go and lay down under that tree." He slowly pointed to a giant oak at the edge of her yard, and Daisy, too stunned and out of her depth to speak, thought, "But I have a Chesterfield." "Thank you, Daisy, but I need something with deep roots." He had read her thought, and she knew this should frighten her. All of this should frighten her, but it didn't. She watched him as he trotted through the torrents of rain to the oak at the edge of her property. She could just make out his form now in the shadows as it lowered to the sopping ground. Then thunder rocked overhead, and she was suddenly back to herself and called out, "Jacob, what are you doing? Come back!" terrified he would be killed. Then the lightning struck the old oak tree. When she looked back on that night, she would always wonder why she had heard the thunder before the lightning struck, and she would remember falling to her knees, sopping wet and mud-streaked by the jagged smoking stump of the old oak tree, and instead of finding a body, there would be two giant glowing marbles watching her from the burnt earth. She hated them. The way the two now glass eyes followed her, she dug the hole and shoved them in. Even in the daytime, she felt those eyes in the ground following her as she came and went from her home. Once she decided if Jacob did not come back for them, she would work up the nerve to destroy them herself, maybe smash them on the cement with a shovel. But in her heart, she knew Jacob would be back. He had, after all, left a piece of himself for her safekeeping.